Amen. Well, I'm going to summarize our study in 1st and 2nd Samuel, just kind of after well over a year of being in this book. It's kind of hard to put it down and, just move right on. So we're going to do a little bit, and I showed you this last week in talking about how that, again, remind you that we broke the book down, 1 Samuel, into the study of Samuel, Saul, and David, and we'll break that a little bit more down tonight. And then 2 Samuel really was all about David and him really in his kingship and his command, his conquests, but also his conflicts. David had troubles. There's no question about that. When we begin to look, for instance, if we just take Samuel and begin to think about all the way back when we started this, to get to Samuel, you first had to begin with Hannah, then you got to go to Elkanah, and you got to remember the story of Peninnah that's there as well. Then after a little bit, you'd learn about Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas. Now, all those stories, really, you begin to look at and notice the providential hand of God right from the very beginning. Now, Samuel is also that transition character of going from judge to king, from a theocracy to a monarchy. So there's a lot that goes on, but you have to know something about her vow, about Hannah's vow. You have to know about her prayer. You have to remember these things and how blessed you are to look at her life. And of course, then you see the harsh judgment of God on Eli and his two wicked sons. But it also shows you there's a real change that's beginning to take place in Israel. And to see how this really does change the whole dynamic of a new kingdom, because it does, again, begins a new monarchy. And remember, Samuel was very upset over that whole thing. But God told him, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. From there, of course, we find that Saul is the chosen king of Israel. He comes from the family of Kish. We learn right off the bat that he is seemingly a very humble young man. God blesses him and anoints him, but also causes him to be able to prophesy with the prophets. And so people call him a prophet. He is granted and given the monarchy. What a rich blessing bestowed upon him, not just him, but you think about all of his lineage that would come after him would be included in this monarchy. But we know the story of what happened to him because he lost his humility, because he no longer saw himself as little when he ought to have seen himself that way. He was rejected from being king because he disobeyed God and did not wait for the prophet as he should, and he inserted himself into the priesthood by offering the offerings that he should have never been involved in. His life, of course, doesn't end with that particular rejection, because he goes on to be king for some time. But as he does that, at the same time, then we notice the beginning of a young man by the name of David. David is just a real blessing to learn and to listen to and to watch. Well, one of the most interesting facts before I get into some of his life is just to note 1 Samuel 16, 13, and 14. Because if you look at those verses right there is the key. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, talking about David, in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. But that's the point. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. But look at the next verse. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit troubled him. Well, to go on, of course, we know that David was of the tribe of Judah, which is going to play a prominent role in Israel's history. Talking about Israel as a nation. We know that David was a shepherd, which comes into play with a lot of his songs and his music. That's why we look at him not only as the shepherd, but as the psalmist of Israel, as the minstrel of Israel. As a leader, we watch him and how that as he leads, men crowd to be with him and to fight with him. But we also learn that he is still a sinner, a big-time sinner. But I'll give you a little bit more a little bit later. Even though he is a sinner, he is a fighter for the Lord. He's a fighter for Israel. And he is one that God has put his hand upon him to protect him. Over and over again, we see different things happen in his life that God does to protect him. And a lot of times, the psalmist of Israel is used by God to pin those words into a song that we get to sing and that all of Israel got to sing. When we look at the fact that God protected him, we learn that he protected him inside caves, protected him when he was surrounded by the enemy. He protected him in enemy territory against superior forces, and even protected him from his own family members who wanted him dead. But then we learn also that God was very gracious with David and gave him a covenant that his family would be the one that would produce the seed of the Messiah. What a blessing indeed. Now, as we look through, and I already mentioned some of the characters from Samuel's life, when you begin to look at Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah, and then Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas. But if we start looking with all three of these men, you start noticing, and this is not a complete list, but every one of the names that you're seeing come up on the screen up there have a powerful message in and of themselves. When we look at Goliath, who doesn't remember, or you can't hardly forget him? Joab, of course, Jonathan, Abner, Michal, his wife, Nathan the prophet, Absalom, his son, and the rebel, Amnon, Zadok, the high priest, Sheba, the one who rebelled against David, the one whose head got thrown over a wall. Remember that? Ahimaaz and Cushai, Ahithophel, who was David's counselor and turned against him. Bathsheba, we could not forget, of course. Uriah the Hittite, Ziba, Shimei, the one who cursed David. You have Nabal, Mephibosheth, the Gibeonites, Ishbosheth, Abigail, Rizpah, and Nabal. We sometimes, because you look at Abigail and Nabal, that story in itself is a rich and wonderful story. And then Rizpah, what a story, along with Mephibosheth, about the redemption of us, our Redeemer. And a story that we can see, just like the covenant that God made with David, is a particular picture of the eternal covenant of grace that we can learn from. Then some of the other things that we learn in this particular story, of course, some of it, a lot of it is going to be complementary in 1 Kings and elsewhere when you look at through the other stories, and you'll get some of this additional information. But you also think about the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, what a mighty story when you begin to look. It didn't begin here. It wasn't built here. But it becomes a center to Israel's history and to her worship. We see that the mercy seat is on top. We see it does again become that center of worship. And then we begin to remember how that the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, but how that the Philistines returned it real quickly. You know, see, we can all giggle because we remember the story of it. And then, of course, how that 70,000 men, when they decided they would look into, meaning they lifted the lid and looked into the Ark of the Covenant, 70,000 men died. Then we also learn that after the Philistines had sent back the Ark of the Covenant, how did they send it back? They sent it back on a cart being pulled by an oxen, by a cow actually, that was there. So I guess David and all of Israel thought it was okay for them to do the same thing. But then they learned as they were bringing the Ark of the Covenant back that as that went across a threshing floor, and here they are partying hard, they're excited, they're singing, rejoicing in front of the ark, and all of a sudden the oxen stumble, the ark looks like it's going to tumble. A man reaches up, Uzzah is his name, and he tries to steady it, and he's killed dead immediately. David is shocked. He shouldn't have been, because they should have never been carrying the ark that way. Later they go back, he does, and he learns, he studies, and he researches, and he finds out. And a very important lesson was that they did not do it according to the Scriptures. The ark was never to be carried that way. That's why then you can see that, too, David longed to make the Ark of the Covenant and give it a place of honor. And eventually he did find the most solemn place, a historical location where God's hand was clearly seen in the life of Israel, both in David's life and, of course, all the way back to Abraham's life. Those two particular points and what happened here makes it a place where we know that's where the temple was built. Then we look at some practical lessons. We learn about how to fight without fear. Is there not a cause? David was just a little man down when they were fighting in a standoff between the Philistines. I shouldn't even call it a standoff. The Philistines were intimidating all of Israel with Goliath. But what did he say? David said, is there not a cause? It's a rallying call for all of us. The words next you see up there after the do order have to do with the ark, again, of how David had to learn. Listen, what somebody else may be able to do, you may not be able to do. It may be okay for the Philistines to put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart, but it's not okay for the Israelites to do it because they had instructions. They were told to put rings on each side of it and have staves that go through, and it was to be carried by the priests that were there. So that's why he said, because we did it not after the due order. Or how about when we learn the story that David had hidden from everyone he thought, but in fact so many people knew David's sin that finally God sent Nathan to him, told him a story about a man being hungry and stealing one man's poor little sheep. David said, who is he? We'll take him out. Until you can just see Nathan raise his hand, thou art the man, David. And then we know too that again how that there were things that happened where the Lord had kept David from sinning. He had kept others from sinning. The Lord hath withholden thee. Also we see the the promise of God, where thy house and kingdom shall be established forever. Remember the story, the wonderful story to me, of the mulberry trees, where you have to wait on the Lord. What a practical lesson. You may be able to get down there, get ready to battle, but God says wait for the appropriate time. He told David and his men, you wait until you hear the sound among the tops of the mulberry trees. And then, of course, we have not just one, not two, but three different stories in the cave of Adullam. And then, of course, we all know from even being children raised in Sunday school about a little boy named David. That's right, in a sling and a stone. Only a boy named David, only a tiny sling. All those things we learn. We learn about, too, even with him, about how to root out bitterness. Or how, even with a sad story like Ahithophel, that we ought not let bitterness ever take hold of our lives. We learn, because of David, to own our own sin, to confess it before God, and then ask for that joy of salvation to be returned. We learn about Abigail's humility, but yet her forward speaking to David, again, where she said, the Lord hath withholden thee from this, that he would keep thee. We learn about the promise of the Messiah. We learn how to accept a no from God, where David was asking God constantly, I want to build you a house. And God told him no. So he did as much as he could do by preparing the material, preparing the place, and giving the job to Solomon. God promised him to build him a house forever. And even though David was not allowed to build God a house, God built him a house. We also see how that David is just a picture of God's grace, a trophy of God's grace. Two, we also learn that we don't need to be a larger or a better equipped force to be victorious. All we need is the Lord. Remember Jonathan? Remember David? Remember the battles that they fought? They would be outnumbered, and yet God would use them to win. We could learn from the song of Hannah or the songs of David, the songs of victory, the songs of forgiveness. We are taught in this story that to obey is better than sacrifice. We are taught in circumstances when David is banished by Saul and then banished by Absalom, that when David acted the part of a madman, remember that? Went down and had let the drool so that he would survive that particular encampment. Or we're taught about the woman of Tekoa, the death of Ahithophel, the rash vow of Saul, the depression of Saul, the death of Saul. And then we also learn about the witch of Endor. You can't forget about that. Don't have anything to do with those. We saw the plagues that killed 70,000 when David made a choice of chastening. And then we saw the burnt offerings and the peace offerings that brought a stop to the plague. We even see the worst stories that we can still learn from Eli and his wicked sons. We learn that, listen, you better discipline your children and tell them to do what's right, because that's what Eli never did. We learn about Saul and his disobedience. Again, that without offering sacrifice and seeking that witch of Endor, how Saul made a mess of his life. We learn from David's sin with Bathsheba to his murder of Uriah, to the rape of his daughter by his own son, to the rebellion of Absalom, and even Absalom's defiling of David's concubines in public. We see, as I already mentioned to you, but I'll show you the verses again, 2 Samuel 7:16, where God told David, "In thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee, and thy throne shall be established forever." Now, it doesn't take much. You're talking about human beings here, so there's got to be one born of the seed of David that's not, according to this life, temporary. That's a reference to Jesus Christ being on the throne of David forever. And when Saul is rejected, we learn about this fact about David. But now when he says, "Thy kingdom shall not continue," the Lord has sought him, what kind of a man? A man after his own heart. That doesn't mean that David was perfect, because we know he's not. But God sought a man after his own heart, which meant what? That when David sinned, he turned around and confessed. It may have even taken a while, but he confessed and forsake that sin. When the ark was moved by the Philistines by a cart and oxen, again, no problem. But we learned that we can't do the things that the world can do. We also learn about the laws of the harvest. Sow to the flesh, and of the flesh you'll reap corruption. It's exactly what happened to David. Even though he was forgiven and his monarchy was delivered from destruction, his family would suffer greatly because of his sin. We saw how David sorrowed over the death of his own son who sought his life. He never gloated or gloried. In fact, you never see David gloating or glory over anyone's death. He may have asked for it. He may have asked for in his Psalms the death of his enemies, but you never see him gloat over it. The greatest stories that you're going to see is how that David is a type of Christ, a type of the Messiah. We learn that he's the rightful king, the Lord of hosts. He's the lamp who David says will lighten his darkness. He calls him my rock, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my high tower, and my Savior. All of David's triumphs and troubles are obvious in these two books that we've studied, and they're full of practical lessons for us today. When we begin to look at David's reign, one of the things that we notice is, of course, that it says that David reigned over Israel 40 years. 7 of them, of course, in Hebron, which was in his hometown in Judea, and then 33 years reigned he in Jerusalem. And you know what we learned? We learned that his particular monarchy was characterized by these particular words. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. We see that in several places, and how that other kings, in fact, I will tell you, every other king was monitored and measured by David. In 2 Kings 16:2, I know that's out of our realm, but still it's the same passage and same ideas, that 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And notice this, and he didn't do that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. David did do that which was right. Even Solomon, as wise as he was, as great as he was, you know what the scriptures say? In 1 Kings 11:6, and Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. You don't have to be perfect. You're a sinner and you're not going to be perfect. But when you do follow hard and follow fully after the Lord. Every king afterwards, and I won't list them all off, I will put them up here, and you can see all of them. On your left-hand side will be the kings of Israel. That's often called the northern kingdom. And you'll not see but one king that has a mixed following of the Lord. In other words, he was primarily bad, but it says he did do some good. All of those, now this is after Solomon, because after Solomon, God divided the kingdom. And this is why, after Solomon, this is divided kingdom, and you'll see that there are only Asa, Jehoshaphat, then you have Joash, and even he was mixed, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, and Hezekiah, and then Josiah were the only ones that it says followed after the Lord like David did. They did that which was right in the sight of God. Every other one, they either did evil in the sight of God, maybe with a sprinkled bit of good, or they were bad kings. But there was none like David. You've read, even though we're going to look at, maybe, or we're not going to now, but I mean, if you keep reading, you're going to study and look at Solomon. And really, one of the greatest kings was able to build the temple, the most beautiful temple that ever was there in Israel. And yet none were after God's heart like David was. He was indeed a special man, one that we could learn from, and one that I hope you did learn from as we spent some time with him. So that kind of concludes our study and even a review of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're done with that. And next Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll start on the book of